On a Tuesday morning in the spring of 1978, Willis Barren drove his mail truck, his neighbor's mail truck. His own wasn't running to the end of the lane and found a letter in the box that would change everything. It wasn't threatening on the outside, plain white envelope, legal department return address, Chicago, Rock Island and Pacific Railroad. Willis read it once standing right there at the mailbox. Then he folded it, put it back in the envelope, drove the truck back to the barn, and went inside to read it again at the kitchen table. It said the railroad was taking part of his land. Not asking, taking. They called it eminent domain. The law said they could do it. The letter said so. The attached survey map said so. And the check they were offering, $12,000, said they'd already decided the matter was settled. Willis set the letter down and looked out the kitchen window at the hay meadow on the south side of the tracks, green in April. The same green it had been every April he could remember. The same meadow his grandfather's cattle had grazed when this farm was built. He looked at the concrete underpass beneath the railroad bridge. The cattle crossing his grandfather August had poured by hand in 1922, and he thought about what the letter was really saying. It was saying, the thing that makes your farm a farm is now ours. Not the fields, not the barn, not the house, just the connection between them, the artery, the crossing. Without it, the north and south halves of the Barren farm were two separate fields with a railroad between them, and nothing to bridge the gap, except a 2-mile drive down a county road. Willis had a lawyer, a good one by Poweshiek County standards. Phil Carmichael practiced out of a converted house on the town square in Grinnell and had handled property disputes, estate fights, and more than a few DUIs going back 20 years. Willis drove to see him that afternoon. Phil read the letter. He studied the survey map. Then he looked at Willis over his reading glasses and told him the truth, the way lawyers tell the truth when the law is not on your side. They can take it, Willis. Eminent domain is eminent domain. The railroad has used this power since 1863. A judge won't stop the taking. We can argue the price. Maybe get you 18 or 20,000 instead of 12, but the land goes. Willis looked at him. So no matter what I do, I lose the crossing. That's what the law says. Willis thanked him, paid for the hour, and drove home. That night, Lorraine sat across from him at the kitchen table, the same lamp, the same window looking out at the dark fields. And she said something Willis had not expected from a woman who had spent 38 years offering perspective without orders. She said, "Don't let them take it." Not a question, not a suggestion, a declaration. Willis looked at her for a long time. Your grandfather didn't buy this farm so a railroad could cut it in half whenever it felt like it. And no law written by men who have never farmed a day in their lives is going to change what this land means to this family. Willis nodded once. That was the whole conversation. Now let me tell you about Willis Barren. Because to understand what he did the next morning, you need to understand the kind of man he was. Willis was 62 years old in 1978. He had been born in the upstairs bedroom of the farmhouse in January of 1916. He had lived on that land every day of his life except 3 years in the Pacific during the war, 1943 to 1946. And when he came back certain. Certain the land was where he belonged and that it always would be. His grandfather, August Barren, had bought the 240 acres in 1919 for $11,000. The railroad tracks were already there when August arrived. August had built around them, arranged the whole operation with the tracks as a fixed fact of the landscape. Fences, pastures, hay ground, hog lots, everything was organized around that steel line bisecting the farm from east to west. But August needed a way across. In 1922, he negotiated with the Rock Island for permission to build a cattle crossing, a concrete underpass beneath the tracks, wide enough for cattle to pass single file. He poured the concrete himself using a hand-mixed batch that took 3 weeks. He laid the wooden deck beams with 2 neighbors and a team of draft horses. He tested 3 locations before he chose the spot, rejecting 2 because of drainage problems and settling on the 3rd, because it sat on a natural gravel bed that kept the ground dry year-round. August had not built that crossing by accident. He had built it by knowledge. Willis had been walking cattle through it since he was 10 years old, south in the morning, north in the evening, rain, snow, mud, heat, it didn't matter. The herd went through the crossing twice a day, every season for 52 years, approximately 18,000 times. The path was worn smooth by generations of hooves, a groove in the earth that was as much a part of the farm as the barn itself. The railroad wanted to fill that groove with gravel and steel. Willis was not going to let that happen. At 6 o'clock on Wednesday morning, the day after the letter, the day after the lawyer, the day after Lorraine's declaration, Willis Barren drove his 1953 Farmall Super M out of the barn. The Farmall was 25 years old. It weighed 6,500 pounds. It had 48 horsepower and a turning radius short enough to put it squarely across 2 rails. Willis drove it down the lane, across the hay meadow and onto the tracks. He positioned it carefully, front wheels on the north rail, rear wheels straddling the south, the tractor sitting perpendicular to the line, completely blocking passage in both directions. He shut off the engine. He climbed down. He sat on the rail beside the tractor, facing east, the direction the trains came from. And he waited. He brought nothing with him. No sign, no megaphone, no crowd, no press. Just a man, a tractor, and the complete absence of any intention to move. The morning eastbound freight arrived at 7:42. 67 cars of grain and merchandise out of Des Moines, bound for the Mississippi transfer point at Davenport. The engineer saw the tractor from about a mile out. He thought it was a crossing accident at first. A farmer stalled on the tracks. He started braking. The train slowed. As it got closer, the engineer realized the tractor wasn't stalled. It was parked, deliberately, with a man sitting beside it on the rail. The train stopped about 200 yards away. The engineer blew the horn. Willis didn't move. 3 long blasts, the emergency signal. Willis sat on the rail and looked at the locomotive the way you look at a thunderstorm, with respect but without fear. The conductor walked forward along the ballast to where Willis was sitting. "Sir, you've got to move this tractor. You're blocking a mainline railroad." "I know. This is a federal offense. Obstruction of interstate commerce." "I expect it is." "Are you going to move it?" "I am not." The conductor stared at him for a moment. Then he turned around and walked back to the train. 40 minutes later, a Rock Island section foreman was there. 30 minutes after that, a young man from the railroad's legal department in Des Moines arrived, having driven at a speed that probably violated several traffic laws. His name was Kevin Doherty, 28 years old, 2 years out of Drake Law School, polished shoes that were about to become very muddy. Kevin walked up to Willis with the confidence of a man who had the entire legal framework of American railroad law memorized. "Mr. Barren, I'm Kevin Doherty, counsel for the Chicago, Rock Island, and Pacific Railroad. You are currently obstructing a Class 1 railroad mainline, which is a federal crime under Title 18, Section 1511 of the United States Code. I'm instructing you to remove your vehicle from the tracks immediately." Willis looked at the young lawyer, looked at the clean suit and the briefcase and the face that had never been sunburned because it had never spent a full day outdoors. "Son," Willis said, "I've been sitting on this rail since 6 o'clock this morning. I've been farming this land since 1940. I've been looking at these tracks since 1916, which is the year I was born. You've been looking at them since about 20 minutes ago." He pointed east. "That train is sitting on my land, not the railroad's land, my land. The original right-of-way through this property is 60 feet wide. Your train is on that 60 feet and I've never objected. But the letter I got yesterday says you want 40 more feet on each side. That's my hayfield. That's my cattle crossing. That's my livelihood." He pointed at the Farmall. "This tractor is sitting on the 60 feet the railroad already owns. I'm not blocking anything that isn't yours. But until somebody explains to me why a railroad that's had 60 feet for 115 years suddenly needs 140, and why my cattle crossing and my hay meadow have to die for it, this tractor is staying right where it is." Kevin Doherty opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Mr. Barren, regardless of your grievance, obstructing a railroad. Call the sheriff, I'll wait." The Poweshiek County Sheriff, Bob Trueblood, had grown up on a farm 3 miles from Willis's place. He arrived at 10:30, looked at the tractor, looked at Willis, looked at Kevin Doherty. "Willis," Bob said. "Bob, you're blocking a railroad. That's what they tell me. I'm supposed to arrest you." "I know." Bob looked at the train. The engineer was in his cab reading a magazine. The conductor was leaning against a fence post smoking. Kevin Doherty was on his car phone, the kind that weighed 11 pounds and had an antenna on the roof, talking to his supervising attorney in Des Moines. "Willis," Bob said, "if I arrest you, they'll just tow the tractor and run the train. Then they'll have to tow the tractor. That's a 1953 Farmall Super M 3 tons, parking brake set. They'll need a wrecker. Nearest one big enough is in Grinnell, 45 minutes each way plus an hour for setup. You've thought this through." "I've had since yesterday." Bob Trueblood did something that Kevin Doherty did not expect. He took off his hat, scratched his head, said, "I'm going to get some coffee. I'll be back in about an hour, maybe 2. I suggest everyone use the time to think about what they really want here." He drove away. Kevin Doherty stood on the tracks, shoes ruined, watching the sheriff's car disappear down the county road, and understood for the first time that he was in a jurisdiction where the sheriff was a farm boy, the farmer was a local hero, and the railroad was the outsider. Now let me tell you about the next 5 months, because Willis Barren didn't park his tractor on the tracks just once. The railroad had the Farmall towed that first afternoon. Cost them $600. Willis was not arrested. Bob Trueblood had quietly told Kevin Doherty that arresting a 62-year-old farmer for protecting his land would not play well in the local papers, and that the county attorney would likely decline to prosecute. The next morning, the Farmall was back on the tracks. The railroad had it towed again. Willis put it back. Towed again, back again, towed a third time, back a fourth. By the end of the first week, the Rock Island had spent $4,200 on towing fees. The morning eastbound freight had been delayed 4 out of 5 days, and the story had been picked up by the Grinnell Herald-Register, the Des Moines Register, and 3 television stations. Farmer parks tractor on railroad tracks to fight eminent domain. The headline was everything. It went beyond Iowa. The wire services picked it up. Letters started arriving at the Barren farm from farmers in Nebraska, Kansas, Missouri, Illinois. Farmers who had lost land to eminent domain. Farmers who were fighting pipeline companies, highway departments, power companies. Farmers who had been told the law is the law and had accepted it, and now watched a 62-year-old man from Poweshiek County refuse to accept it. Willis received over 300 letters in the first month. He answered every one by hand, sitting at the kitchen table in the evenings, writing in the careful cursive his mother had taught him, telling each person the same thing: "I'm just a farmer who doesn't want to lose his crossing. If that helps you, I'm glad." Lorraine handled the phone calls, dozens of them. She screened everyone, declined most, and agreed to exactly one: Janet Howerin from the Des Moines Register, who spent 3 hours at the kitchen table and asked Willis why he didn't just take the money and build a new crossing somewhere else. "There is no somewhere else," Willis said. "My grandfather tested 3 locations before he poured the concrete. 2 had drainage problems. The third, where the crossing is now, sits on a gravel bed that drains naturally. He didn't build it there by accident. He built it there because it was the only place that worked. The railroad offered a new crossing half a mile south. Half a mile south is clay soil. It floods every spring. And half a mile south means my cattle walk an extra mile every day." He paused. "You want to explain to my cows why they need to walk further, because a railroad in Des Moines drew a straight line on a map." Janet's article ran front page, syndicated to 14 Iowa newspapers. The headline was simple and perfect: "Farmer won't move for the railroad or his tractor." The railroad tried a different approach. Kevin Doherty's supervising attorney, a senior partner named Martin Gaines, 54 years old, 20 years of railroad condemnation work, drove to Poweshiek County personally. Martin Gaines was not Kevin Doherty. He was experienced enough to know that this situation had moved beyond legal tactics into something else entirely. The railroad was losing the public relations war. Every day the tractor went back on the tracks was another day of coverage, another round of sympathy for the farmer, another editorial in another paper asking whether the law that said a railroad could take a farmer's crossing was really the law anyone meant to write. Martin asked for a meeting. Willis agreed. They sat at the kitchen table. "Mr. Barren, I'm here to find a solution. The railroad needs the siding, but we don't need a war." "I don't need a war either. I need my cattle crossing and my hay meadow." "The siding requires 80 feet of additional right-of-way." "I understand the engineering. What I don't understand is why the 80 feet have to come from my hay meadow, when there's 80 acres of open ground east of my property that belongs to nobody." Martin paused. "What do you mean belongs to nobody?" "The Hoffman Tract. Been in tax delinquency since '74. County owns it. Nobody farms it. Growing up in weeds and volunteer trees. You could run your siding through there without touching a working farm." "We surveyed the corridor." "You surveyed a straight line. Straight lines are easy for engineers and hard on farmers. Bend the line 50 yards south at my east fence. Run it through the Hoffman Tract. Bend it back at my west fence. You get your siding. I keep my crossing and my meadow. The county sells you tax-delinquent land for back taxes, probably less than you're offering me." Martin Gaines looked at Willis Barren, the overalls, the calloused hands, the face weathered by 62 years of Iowa wind, and realized he was sitting across from a man who had not only refused to accept the taking, but had spent 5 months designing a better solution than the railroad's own engineers had found. "You've been thinking about this." "I've been thinking about it since the day I got your letter. I drove the Hoffman Tract the morning after, walked the whole 80 acres. Soil's poor, that's why Hoffman abandoned it, but soil doesn't matter for a rail bed. Gravel matters, and that ground is flat, well-drained, and exactly where your siding needs to be if you bend the line 200 feet south. My meadow floods in spring. The Hoffman ground doesn't. Your siding will perform better on the Hoffman Tract than on my meadow." Willis looked at Martin Gaines steadily. "Your engineers drew a straight line on a map in Des Moines. I've been looking at this ground for 46 years. I know where the water drains, where the soil holds, where the grade works. I know things about this land that don't appear on any survey map because no survey map has walked it in every season for half a century." Martin was quiet for a long time. "I need to talk to our engineers." "Take your time. The tractor's not going anywhere." Martin Gaines took Willis's proposal back to Chicago. The engineering department was resistant. The original survey had been approved, the condemnation papers filed, the schedule set. Changing the route meant new surveys, new environmental assessments, new legal filings. But Martin was a practical man. He ran the numbers. Continued fight, ongoing towing fees, legal fees climbing past $40,000, train delays accumulating, public relations damage spreading to every farm community in central Iowa. A story that would not die because a farmer kept putting his tractor back on the tracks every time they removed it. Hoffman tracked alternative, purchased from the county for approximately $4,000 in back taxes. New survey, $15,000. Revised filings, $5,000. Total, $24,000. Versus $60,000 and climbing. The math was not complicated. In September of 1978, 6 months after the letter arrived, 5 months after the first tractor on the tracks, the Rock Island sent Willis Barren a new letter. The railroad was withdrawing its condemnation action against the Barren property. The siding would be built through the Hoffman tract on a route that bent south at Willis's east fence line and returned to the original corridor at his west fence line. The cattle crossing would remain. The hay meadow would remain. The farm would remain whole. Willis read the letter at the kitchen table. Lorraine sat across from him. "They're not taking the land," Willis said. "I know. The siding goes through the Hoffman tract." "I know. My crossing stays." Lorraine reached across the table and took his hand. They sat there for a while, not saying anything. Some victories don't need words. The farmall went back in the barn that afternoon. Over 5 months, it had been placed on the tracks or been ready to be placed on the tracks 11 times. It had been towed 7 times. It had caused approximately 46 hours of train delays and cost the Rock Island more in towing, legal fees, and public relations damage than the Hoffman tract cost them to purchase. A 6,500-pound tractor had stopped 12,000 miles of railroad. Not by force, by refusal. The Rock Island built the siding through the Hoffman tract in the fall of 1978. The route worked exactly as Willis had said. Flat, well-drained, no flooding. The railroad's own engineers admitted privately that the Hoffman route was superior to the original plan. Willis never said, "I told you so." He didn't need to. The trains ran past his farm on the new siding every day, and every day the cattle crossing was still there, and the hay meadow was still green. The Rock Island went bankrupt in 1980, 2 years after the Barren dispute. The line through Poweshiek County was eventually absorbed by the Iowa Interstate Railroad. The siding built through the Hoffman tract is still in use. The route Willis proposed from his kitchen table is still the route, and his grandfather's concrete cattle crossing is still standing. Willis farmed until 1989. His son Craig took over the 240 acres, whole, uncut, connected by the crossing a railroad tried to destroy and a farmer refused to lose. Willis died in 1997 at 81. His funeral was at the Methodist Church in Grinnell. Bigger than anyone expected. Farmers from 3 counties came. Phil Carmichael came, the lawyer who had said the law was on the railroad's side. Janet Howerin came, the reporter who had written the story that spread it everywhere. Bob Trueblood came, retired now, still drinking coffee at the same pace. Craig spoke at the service. "Every morning of my childhood I walked through that crossing with my father and the cattle. Rain, snow, mud, heat didn't matter. South in the morning, north in the evening, and my father walked with them through a concrete underpass that his grandfather built with his own hands. That crossing wasn't infrastructure. It was the heartbeat of the farm. And when someone tried to stop that heartbeat, my father sat down on a railroad track and said no." Craig paused. "People called what my father did a protest. It wasn't. A protest is against something. A refusal is for something. My father wasn't against the railroad. He was for the crossing. He was for the farm that his grandfather built, and he intended to pass it on whole." 2 people sent flowers who nobody expected. Martin Gaines, the senior railroad attorney, sent a card. It read, "He was right and he made us better for it." The other was Kevin Doherty. The young lawyer who had stood on the tracks in his polished shoes and cited federal statute at a farmer sitting on a rail. Kevin Doherty left the Rock Island in 1979. He went into private practice in Grinnell of all places. He specialized in property law. He represented farmers. Years later, someone asked Kevin why he switched sides. Because I stood on a set of railroad tracks and watched a 62-year-old farmer teach me more about property rights in 10 minutes than I learned in 3 years of law school. He didn't cite a single statute. He just pointed at his hay meadow and said, "That feeds my cattle." And I realized that all the law in the world doesn't matter if you forget what the land is for. The Farmall Super M is still on the Barren farm. Craig keeps it in the barn on the same maintenance schedule Willis followed. Oil every 50 hours, grease every week, valve adjustment every 500 hours. The tractor is 73 years old. It has been on the railroad tracks 11 times. It has never lost. Craig's daughter Amy is 16. She asked her father once why Grandpa Willis put the tractor on the tracks. Because the railroad wanted to take our crossing. But wasn't that illegal? Probably. Wasn't he scared? Craig thought about it for a moment. Your grandfather weighed about 170 pounds, and he parked a 3-ton tractor in front of a 200-ton locomotive because he believed his hay meadow mattered more than the railroad schedule. Was he scared? He paused. I don't think so. I think he was the opposite of scared. I think he was certain. Certain of what? Certain that some things aren't for sale, not for $12,000, not for any amount. The crossing, the meadow, the farm, those aren't assets on a balance sheet. They're the reason we're here. And when someone tries to take the reason you're here, you don't negotiate. You sit down on the rail and you wait. Sometimes the smallest thing in the frame is the most powerful. Sometimes a tractor weighs more than a locomotive, not in tons, but in meaning. And sometimes a man sitting on a railroad track, doing nothing, refusing to move, saying almost nothing, is the loudest voice in the county. Willis Barren didn't have the law on his side. He didn't have money, or lawyers with briefcases, or political connections, or a single statute in his favor. He had a Farmall Super M, a hay meadow, a cattle crossing, and the absolute refusal to let a corporation solve its problem by destroying his. The railroad sent a locomotive. Willis sent a tractor. The locomotive blinked.